I don't know why we ever thought it was a good idea. The morgue had been abandoned for years, left to rot after the funding ran out. People in town said it wasn't worth tearing down, and no one had the guts to take over the property. So it sat there crumbling in the shadows of the old hospital that had once fed it corpses. When Chris suggested we check it out for our ghost hunting channel, I should have walked away, but I didn't. None of us did. And now they're gone. It was nearly midnight when we slipped through the broken chain-link fence surrounding the building. The air smelled damp and the overgrown weeds scraped at my ankles. I remember shivering, but not because it was cold. The place had a presence even before we stepped inside. A sagging brick facade loomed over us, its windows black and jagged with shards of glass. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, creaking open as Chris pushed it. The smell hit me straight away. A mix of mildew, rotting wood, and something metallic that clung to the back of my throat. I pulled my shirt over my nose as we shuffled inside, torches bobbing across peeling paint and warped floor tiles. The morgue's layout was straightforward, a long corridor lined with rooms, each one marked by rusted plaques that still bore words like autopsy and storage. Our equipment wasn't anything fancy, a couple of cameras, a digital recorder, and an EMF reader that Chris had bought online for cheap. We weren't professionals. It was just a hobby, something to pass the weekends, but Chris was always pushing it too far, turning harmless fun into something darker. He was the one who suggested the prank, said it would be great for views. The body freezers were at the far end of the morgue, a row of metal drawers set into the wall like some grotesque filing cabinet. Most of the doors were stuck shut, corroded by years of neglect, but one slid open with a shriek of rusted hinges. Chris laughed as he climbed inside, lying flat on the steel tray. He said it would be funny, a jump scare for the video. He'd slide out, screaming or something, while the rest of us pretended to be terrified. Jen was in charge of filming, her camera trained on the drawer as Derek pushed it shut. The metal clanged dully as it sealed Chris inside. We all stood there, waiting for him to make his move. 10 seconds passed, then 20. Derek gave the drawer a light knock, grinning like an idiot. Still nothing. I felt my chest tighten. Derek pulled the handle, yanking the drawer back open. It was empty. For a moment, none of us moved. The steel tray was there, scratched and discolored, but Chris was gone. I stepped closer, shining my torch into the cavity. It wasn't a deep drawer. There was no way he could have hidden himself in there. Jen muttered something about it being a joke, but her voice trembled, the camera shaking in her hands. Derek started pulling open the other drawers one by one. Most of them wouldn't budge, but the ones that did were just as empty. There was no way out of the freezer from the inside. We all knew that. The room felt colder now, the air prickling against my skin. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the walls, the ceiling, the corners, nothing. We called for Chris, our voices bouncing off the tiled walls. Derek ran back down the corridor, checking the other rooms. He came back pale, shaking his head. Jen said we should leave, that Chris would turn up eventually, but I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Not yet. We decided to split up, each taking a different part of the building. I stayed near the freezers, my torch cutting through the dark in jittery arcs. The silence pressed in on me, broken only by the crunch of my boots on debris. Every so often I thought I could hear something scratching, faint and distant, but when I stopped to listen, it was gone. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. No sign of Chris, no sign of Derek or Jen either. I retraced my steps, calling their names. My voice echoed back at me, thin and hollow. The freezer room was empty when I returned. Derek's EMF reader lay on the floor, its screen cracked, and Jen's camera was propped against the wall, still recording. I picked it up, pointing it toward the freezers, but the lens fogged over almost instantly. Wiping it clean did nothing. The fog wasn't on the outside. Something clanged behind me, and I spun around so fast I nearly dropped the camera. One of the freezer drawers was open, just a few inches, but enough to see the tray inside. I hadn't heard anyone enter the room. My hand shook as I stepped closer, the beam of my torch stuttering across the steel. I reached out and pulled the drawer open. The tray was empty, but the smell made my stomach churn, like meat left out in the sun too long. I gagged, stepping back, and that's when I noticed the marks. Scratches on the inside of the drawer, long and jagged, like something had been clawing to get out. They hadn't been there before. My torch flickered, then the camera. The lights dimmed, the darkness closing in around me. I stumbled toward the door, the sound of my breath loud in my ears. The corridor stretched out in front of me, longer than it had been before, or maybe it just felt that way. I ran. Room after room blurred past as I moved, my torch swinging wildly. Every door was open now, the spaces beyond them yawning black and empty. I could hear something behind me, something wet and uneven, like bare feet slapping against the floor. I didn't dare look back. When I reached the exit, the door was off its hinges, lying in the overgrown grass. The night was silent. The others were gone. The footage from Jen's camera was corrupted, nothing but static. The police found no trace of Chris, Derek or Jen, just their equipment abandoned in the dirt. The mine entrance was smaller than I expected, a gaping hole in the side of a hill, surrounded by rusted equipment and overgrown weeds. The wooden beams propping up the opening looked like they were ready to give out any second, weathered grey from decades of neglect. It had been abandoned since the 1950s, or so the story went. A collapse killed a dozen miners, but the official records were vague, and local legends suggested more men went in than ever came out. It wasn't exactly the kind of place you'd pick for a casual hike. There were 5 of us that night: me, Greg, Alison, Sam and Nick. Nick was the newest to the group, fresh-faced and eager, the kind who thought this was all fun and games. The rest of us knew better. We'd done plenty of ghost hunts before, mostly old houses and the occasional graveyard. They were creepy, sure, but it was all harmless in the end. The mine was different, though. None of us said it out loud, but I could tell we were all thinking it. Something about the place felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to be disturbed. We geared up in the fading evening light, torches, spare batteries, cameras, and a couple of walkie-talkies in case we got separated. GPS devices too, though we'd been warned the signals might not work underground. The opening was narrow, forcing us to duck as we stepped inside. The air turned stale almost immediately, damp and metallic, and the beam of my torch barely cut through the thick blackness ahead. The tunnel sloped downward, the floor uneven with loose rocks and broken timber. We moved single file, our footsteps crunching softly in the silence. Greg led the way, his camera mounted on his shoulder, while Nick brought up the rear. The walls felt like they were pressing in as we descended, the ceiling low enough that I kept brushing my head against it. Every so often we'd pass an old tool or a rusted rail cart, relics of a time when this place had been alive with noise and light. It wasn't long before we lost the GPS signals. Alison held up her device, tapping it in frustration as the screen blinked out. No surprise there. We were deep now, deeper than I realized, the tunnel twisting and branching in ways that made it impossible to tell which direction we'd come from. Greg marked the walls with chalk as we went, leaving crude arrows pointing back the way we'd come. We stopped at what must have been a junction. 4 tunnels spread out in front of us, yawning black holes that seemed to stretch forever. Greg handed out glow sticks, snapping them to life and tossing them into the other tunnels to mark our path. The green light barely illuminated the ground before being swallowed by the darkness. It was around then that the flashlights started acting up. The beams would flicker for a second or two, then return to normal. It happened to all of us, even though the batteries were fresh. Greg joked about it being interference from the rocks, something about magnetism or electrical fields. I didn't say anything, but I gripped my torch tighter. The first sound came from behind us, a faint scrape, like something brushing against the wall. We all stopped, shining our lights back up the tunnel, but there was nothing there. Just the rocks and the darkness. Greg waved it off as an echo, the noise carrying strangely in the confined space. It made sense, I suppose, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Nick was jumpy by then. I could see it in the way he kept glancing over his shoulder, his torch shaking in his hand. He was falling behind, so I dropped back to walk beside him. He said he was fine, but his face was pale and he kept muttering under his breath. I figured it was just nerves, first-timer jitters. We pushed on, deeper into the mine. The air grew colder, biting at my exposed skin. Every breath felt damp, like the moisture in the air was clinging to my lungs. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, the ceiling disappearing into blackness above us. Old machinery sat rusting in the corners, skeletal remains of whatever work had been done here. Greg set up the camera, sweeping it across the room, while Alison held the EMF meter. The needle twitched wildly, jumping back and forth as if it couldn't decide where to land. That's when Nick bolted. He didn't say anything, didn't even try to explain. 1 second he was standing next to me, and the next he was running back the way we'd come. his torch bouncing wildly in the dark. I shouted after him, but he didn't stop. His footsteps echoed down the tunnel, fading until there was nothing. Then he screamed. It was distant, muffled by the layers of rock between us, but it cut through the silence like a knife. It wasn't a cry for help, not exactly. It was raw, panicked, the sound of someone who'd seen something they couldn't understand. We stood frozen, the echoes of his voice lingering in the still air. Then, silence. Greg tried the walkie-talkie, but there was only static. Allison's face was pale, her hands trembling as she gripped the EMF meter. Sam kept shining his torch into the tunnel Nick had run down, as if expecting him to come back. But he didn't. We didn't know what to do. Go after him, split up. Every option felt like a bad idea, but we couldn't just leave him. Greg decided we'd backtrack, follow the chalk marks, and hope we found him along the way. I didn't argue, I just wanted to get out. The tunnels felt different on the way back, like they'd shifted somehow. The chalk marks were still there, but the path didn't feel familiar. The flickering lights grew worse, cutting out for longer stretches, until we were left in darkness more often than not. I kept close to the others, the sound of their breathing the only thing grounding me. We found his torch first, lying on the ground near one of the junctions. It was still on, the beam pointed uselessly at the wall. There was no sign of him, no tracks, nothing. Just the torch and the emptiness. We didn't find anything else. By the time we reached the surface, dawn was breaking, the grey light washing over the hills. The air outside was sharp and clean, but it did nothing to steady my nerves. Greg called the police once we got a signal, and they organized a search team. They went back into the mine, but they didn't find him. They didn't find anything. The railway tunnel was longer than I expected. It stretched into the hillside, a perfect black arch surrounded by overgrown brush and crumbling bricks. The entrance was flanked by rusted signs warning trespassers to keep out, though years of graffiti made it hard to tell what they had once said. It had been abandoned for decades after the accident, a derailment that killed everyone aboard. Most of the wreckage was cleared, but the tracks were left behind, snaking into the darkness like the remains of some ancient beast. We were a group of 4, me, Chris, Jen and Derek. None of us were professionals, just a mix of curious amateurs who spent weekends poking around old places. The tunnel had been Chris's idea. He'd read something online about it being haunted and thought it would make a good addition to our collection of stories. I didn't like the idea of a place with a history of tragedy, but I went along anyway. It seemed harmless enough, at least at the start. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the hills. By the time we reached the entrance, the daylight had faded to a dull grey, the kind that made it hard to tell where the horizon ended and the ground began. We set up our equipment just outside the tunnel. A couple of cameras, an EMF meter, and a digital recorder. Jen cracked a joke about not needing flashlights since we had our phones, but we brought proper torches anyway. The inside of the tunnel looked like it could swallow light whole. We stepped in together, our footsteps echoing off the curved walls. The air changed immediately, turning damp and cool. The tracks beneath our feet were slick with moss, and puddles collected in the uneven concrete between the rails. I shone my torch ahead, but it barely reached 20 feet before the darkness consumed it. The walls were stained with grime and soot, streaks running down to the floor where water dripped from somewhere unseen. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. Outside you could hear the wind, birds, maybe even the hum of a distant road. Inside there was nothing. Even our voices sounded strange when we spoke, like the tunnel was eating the sound before it could reach too far. I stayed near the middle of the group, not wanting to be in the front or the back. The torchlight bounced off the walls, catching the occasional scrap of metal or stray piece of wood. Then the voices started, faint, far away, but clear enough to make us stop in our tracks. It sounded like someone calling for help, though we couldn't tell what direction it was coming from. Chris pointed his torch down the tunnel, his beam stretching farther than mine, but there was nothing there. The recorder in my hand crackled softly, picking up interference that hadn't been there a moment ago. Jen checked the EMF meter, but it stayed quiet, the needle barely moving. We pressed on, moving slower now. Every few steps the voices would come again. They didn't sound panicked, but there was a desperation to them, like whoever it was had been calling for hours. Sometimes they were ahead of us, other times behind or above. The acoustics of the tunnel made it impossible to pinpoint their source. The deeper we went, the less they sounded human. About halfway through, the rumbling started. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but it grew louder with every step. It wasn't the wind or distant thunder, it sounded like an oncoming train. Chris laughed it off, said something about echoes, but I could see the tension in his shoulders as he glanced back down the tunnel. The rest of us exchanged uneasy looks but kept moving. The air had grown colder, biting against the skin of my neck and hands. The torch beams flickered occasionally, though the batteries were fresh. The rumbling didn't fade. It got stronger, vibrating through the rails beneath our feet. It wasn't constant, it would swell and fade like something was approaching in bursts. My legs tensed with every pulse, half expecting to see headlights rushing toward us from the darkness ahead. But there was nothing. Just the tunnel stretching endlessly forward, the black void swallowing every beam of light we aimed at it. Jen tripped over something, a long piece of rusted metal lying across the tracks. It looked like part of the old wreckage, bent and twisted in a way that didn't seem natural. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands, but Chris told her to leave it. She set it back down carefully, like touching it had left a mark on her skin. The voices came again, closer now. They were louder, layered on top of each other, rising and falling like they were caught in the same rhythm as the rumbling. It was impossible to tell what they were saying, but the sound made my stomach knot. Jen turned back toward the entrance, her torch shaking in her hand. Derek muttered something about the air feeling colder, his breath clouding in front of him. I hadn't noticed until then, but he was right. The temperature had dropped sharply, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. Then the lights went out. Every torch, every camera, even the faint red light on the EMF meter, they all cut out at once. We were plunged into total darkness, the kind that makes you forget your own shape. I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. The rumbling was deafening now, filling the tunnel like a physical force. The ground shook beneath my feet, and the rails felt like they were humming. I stumbled, reaching out blindly for the others, but my hands found nothing. I called out, my voice barely audible over the noise, but there was no response. The rumbling turned into a roar, and for a moment I thought I could see lights in the distance, 2 points growing brighter as they rushed toward me. I dropped to the ground, covering my head, expecting the impact to come any second. But it didn't. The noise stopped suddenly, leaving a silence so complete it made my ears ring. When the torches flickered back on, I was alone. There was no sign of Chris, Jen, or Derek. The tracks stretched into the darkness in both directions, empty and still. I shouted their names, my voice echoing back at me. The EMF meter lay on the ground a few feet away, the needle frozen at 0. I turned and ran, following the tracks back the way we'd come. Every step felt like it took an eternity, the tunnel stretching on forever. When I finally reached the entrance, the sky was bright, the sun high overhead. No one was there. The police found no trace of them. The equipment we left behind was intact, though the cameras recorded nothing but static. The voices, the rumbling, it was all gone. And so were they. The farmhouse sat on a lonely stretch of road about 30 miles outside of town, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. The roof sagged in places, and the wood siding was grey from decades of weather. The locals called it the Sloane place. It had been empty for as long as anyone could remember, though that didn't stop the rumours. A cursed house, they said. Something bad had happened there. A family, maybe. There were too many versions of the story to keep them straight. It was just the two of us that night. Sam and I had been at this ghost hunting thing for a couple of years. Nothing professional, just a hobby, something to break up the monotony of work. Most of the time, we ended up with footage of creaky floorboards and dust motes lit up by torchlight. I didn't expect anything different that night. We parked the car on the overgrown gravel driveway and unloaded the gear, a couple of cameras, an EMF reader, and an infrared thermometer. Sam had a knack for finding places like this, abandoned and ripe with stories. He loved the thrill of it, while I usually found myself counting the hours until we packed up and went home. The front door was already open when we approached. It hung crookedly on its hinges, revealing a dark hallway that smelled of damp wood and mold. The air inside was cool, even though the summer evening outside was still warm. We split up to set the cameras, agreeing to meet back in the kitchen. I started in the parlor, a large room filled with broken furniture and peeling wallpaper. A fireplace dominated one wall, its brick blackened from long-forgotten fires. I placed the camera on a tripod and panned it slowly across the room, capturing the crumbling interior. My torch flickered once and I gave it a shake. The batteries were fresh. Sam called me over to the kitchen. He'd been using the infrared thermometer, pointing it at various spots around the room. The numbers on the screen jumped wildly, from warm to cold and back again. I picked up the EMF reader and swept it across the room. The needle twitched, then shot to the far end of the scale before dropping back down. We decided to move outside. The stories about the Sloan place didn't just stop at the house. The backyard was supposed to be just as cursed. It stretched out into a field bordered by a crooked line of trees. The grass was high, brushing against my knees as we trudged through it. The well was exactly where we'd been told it would be, near the center of the yard, hidden behind a tangle of weeds. It was old, the stones mossy and cracked, and the wooden cover had been pushed aside. Sam knelt beside it, shining his torch down into the darkness. I pulled out the thermometer again. The display flickered, showing temperatures far lower than they should have been for a warm summer night. Sam leaned further over the edge of the well, trying to get a better look. He handed me his torch and lowered himself onto the stone edge, gripping it with both hands. I told him not to be stupid, but before I could say anything else, he slipped. The sound of his body hitting the sides of the well as he fell made me wince. I dropped to my knees and shone the torch down after him. The beam didn't reach the bottom, but I could hear him moving, grunting as he pushed himself upright. He called up to me, saying he was fine, just bruised. I told him to stay put and looked around for something to help him climb out. The field was empty except for the trees and a few scattered pieces of rotting wood. I grabbed one of the sturdier planks and dragged it over to the well. When I leaned over to pass it down, Sam's torch was lying at the bottom, its beam illuminating the well's interior. The stones were slick with moisture and something white stood out against the dark walls. It wasn't clear at first what it was, but then Sam reached for it. Bones. A ribcage partially buried in the dirt. He froze, his hand hovering just above the remains. Then he moved the torch slightly, revealing more. A skull, another set of ribs. There were at least 3, maybe 4 skeletons down there, tangled together like someone had dumped them all at once. I shouted for him to grab the plank, to leave the bones and climb out, but he didn't respond. His torch moved again, the beam flicking across the remains. There was something else down there, something darker than the bones, pressed against the side of the well. The air around me grew colder, so cold that my breath began to cloud in front of my face. I grabbed the plank and leaned further over the edge, trying to get Sam's attention. The torchlight below began to flicker, then died completely. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. Then I heard movement, faint but distinct. It wasn't Sam. I dropped the plank into the well and scrambled back, falling onto the grass. My torch wavered as I pointed it down, but there was nothing to see. No light, no sound. Just the gaping black hole. I called his name over and over, but there was no answer. The police came the next day. They brought a team to excavate the well, and I waited by the car, unable to watch. They pulled out the skeletons just as I'd described. Old, they said, decades old. But there was no sign of Sam. They searched for days, combing the fields, draining the well, checking nearby properties. Nothing. His gear was gone too. No camera, no torch, no walkie-talkie. It was like he'd never been there at all. And the farmhouse is still standing as far as I know. The well is covered now, sealed with concrete, but I've never been back, and I don't think I ever will. I'll never forget the way the factory looked that night. We arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon and the whole place was swallowed in grey. The building was enormous, sprawling across an empty lot with crumbling walls and soot-streaked windows. It had been abandoned for decades, though its reputation hadn't faded. Locals still whispered about the workers who died there, accidents that didn't make sense, machinery that seemed to have a mind of its own. The place had a history that stuck to it like oil. There were 5 of us, loaded down with cameras, tripods, and a few cheap walkie-talkies. None of us were experts. We were just a group of enthusiasts with too much free time and a shared fascination for the unexplained. We'd seen enough paranormal documentaries to know the basics, but none of us were prepared for the sheer scale of the factory. It towered over us as we walked toward it, our footsteps crunching against the gravel-strewn lot. The main door, a massive slab of rusted metal, was wedged open just enough for us to slip through. Inside, the air felt damp with a faint sour smell that clung to the walls. My torch swept across the floor, revealing broken tiles and scattered debris. The place was a labyrinth of twisting corridors and cavernous rooms, each one filled with machinery that seemed frozen in time. Conveyor belts stretched into the darkness, and skeletal remains of assembly lines jutted out at odd angles. The factory had been shut down after a series of unexplained deaths, and it wasn't hard to see why no one wanted to repurpose it. It felt abandoned in a way that didn't feel natural. We split up to set up the cameras, agreeing to meet back near the entrance in an hour. I stayed with Mark, the guy who'd brought most of the equipment, while the others disappeared into the maze of corridors. Mark and I found a spot overlooking one of the larger production floors. The walls were lined with dusty windows, their glass cracked and streaked with grime. Below, a series of machines stood in eerie stillness, their metal arms frozen mid-motion. We placed the camera on a tripod and adjusted it to get a clear shot. As Mark fiddled with the settings, I turned my attention to the room below. My torch beam barely reached the far side, where the shadows swallowed everything past the machinery. There was something unsettling about the silence of the place. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of stillness that made you strain your ears, as though you might pick up on something faint, just on the edge of hearing. A loud bang echoed through the building, making both of us jump. It came from somewhere deeper inside, and it sounded like one of the old metal doors slamming shut. The sound reverberated through the factory, and for a moment I thought I could feel it under my feet. I glanced at Mark, but he was already packing up the gear. He motioned for us to head toward the noise. We grabbed the camera and made our way back into the corridor, our torches cutting through the gloom. The air seemed colder now, and the smell had grown stronger, metallic and sour. As we walked, the sound of our footsteps echoed strangely, bouncing back at us in uneven bursts. The corridors twisted and turned, and it wasn't long before I realized we'd lost our bearings. Mark pulled out one of the walkie-talkies and tried to contact the others, but all we got was static. He fiddled with the dials, but the noise only grew louder, a harsh grating sound that made my teeth ache. We kept walking, hoping to find our way back to the entrance, but every turn seemed to lead us deeper into the factory. We passed another production floor, this one smaller than the last. A single machine stood in the center of the room, its rusted gears frozen in place. Mark stopped to set up another camera, muttering something about needing footage to make the trip worth it. I didn't like the idea of standing still, but I helped him unpack the tripod. That's when the door slammed shut. It was the same loud bang we'd heard earlier, only this time it was right behind us. I spun around, my torch beam catching the edges of the heavy metal door as it settled into its frame. Mark ran to it, but it wouldn't budge. He banged on it with his fists, the sound echoing in the empty room. The static from the walkie-talkie flared again, louder than before, and Mark threw it down in frustration. We were trapped. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking as I gripped the torch. The room felt colder now, and every noise, every creak of the building, every distant thud seemed amplified. I could feel the sweat on the back of my neck, but the air was icy against my skin. Mark moved to the far corner of the room, muttering something about checking for another way out. I stayed near the camera, my eyes fixed on the door. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch further than they should, creeping toward the edges of my torchlight. Then Mark was gone. I didn't see it happen. One moment he was in the corner, his torch sweeping across the walls, and the next he wasn't. His torch lay on the floor, its beam casting a faint glow against the machinery. I called his name, my voice cracking in the empty room, but there was no answer. I grabbed the walkie-talkie and tried to contact the others. The static blared back at me, louder and sharper than before. I switched it off and ran to the door, pulling and yanking with everything I had. It still wouldn't move. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the door. When I finally turned back to the room, the torch on the floor was out. The camera was still running, its red light blinking faintly in the dark. I picked it up and moved toward the far corner, hoping to find some trace of Mark. What I found instead was his wallet and his phone. They were lying neatly on the ground, right where he'd been standing. The phone's screen was cracked, the edges smeared with something dark. The others never found me, the police never found him. The factory was quiet when they searched it, just as abandoned as it had always been. But I know I wasn't alone in that room, and I know Mark didn't leave on his own. I'll say this up front. I never should have gone into that place. There's a good reason people steer clear of abandoned asylums, no matter how much they think they've got the guts to face whatever might be inside. For me, it wasn't about courage, it was about curiosity. Stupid human curiosity. I didn't even believe in ghosts. Not then, anyway. The asylum stood on a patch of overgrown land just outside town. The locals had plenty of stories about it, most of them the sort of things you'd expect. Cruel doctors, patients who vanished without explanation, a fire that took out an entire wing. It had all the ingredients for the kind of place that ends up on ghost hunting shows. That's how I got involved. A mate of mine dragged me into it, saying we'd make a killing if we filmed something creepy enough for the internet. We were a scrappy bunch. No professionals, just four idiots with second-hand cameras, an old EMF reader that barely worked, and a voice recorder that still had someone's cassette tape stuck inside from God knows when. We thought we'd just wander around for a couple of hours, catch some strange noises, and call it a night. The place loomed ahead of us, its windows gaping like black holes. The front door had long since been ripped off its hinges. Inside, the air smelled faintly sour, like mildew and something metallic. My torch picked out the peeling paint on the walls, which curled up like dead skin. I stuck close to the others, my pulse already hammering in my ears. We spread out, setting up cameras in what we thought were good spots. Hallways where the stories claimed people had seen figures or lights. I wasn't too thrilled about splitting up, but the others thought it would make for better footage. So I found myself alone in what used to be the patient dormitories, the light from my torch bouncing off rows of rusted bed frames. I heard something faint then, a high, thin noise, like air being let out of a balloon. I thought it was the wind at first, slipping through the cracks in the walls, but it came again. Higher this time, almost sharp. I felt my skin prickle. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it seemed like it was all around me. I called out for the others, not shouting, but just loud enough for them to hear. No answer. My own breath sounded loud in the silence, and I started to wish I'd never set foot in this place. I tried to keep my mind on practical things, batteries, tape duration, exit points, but my torch flickered, the light cutting in and out. That was when everything seemed to shift. It wasn't a noise that made me stop, it was the absence of one. Every creak and groan of the old building fell away. I don't know if it was my imagination, but it seemed as though even my footsteps didn't echo the way they should. I heard one of the others cry out from somewhere deeper in the asylum. It wasn't a panicked scream, not exactly, but there was something in it that made my chest tighten. I ran in that direction, my torch shaking in my hand. I turned corner after corner, my own shadow jumping ahead of me until I came to the main hallway. The others were there, all of them staring down at one of our cameras. The camera's screen flickered. It wasn't just static. It looked like shapes moving across it, black blotches swimming in the grey. The EMF reader was going wild, its needle slamming back and forth as if it couldn't make up its mind. One of the guys, Todd, I think, reached out to adjust the camera, but the second his fingers touched it, the lights in the hallway flared. Every bulb exploded, sending shards of glass raining down. We ducked, covering our heads, and when I looked back up, the hallway was lit only by the faint glow of our torches. Todd was gone, just gone. We shouted his name, but it was like the walls had swallowed him whole. The EMF reader lay on the floor, sparking faintly, the needle dead. I didn't want to stay in that spot a second longer. We ran down the hallway, our torches swinging wildly. Every door we passed was open, just a crack, like something had been watching us and slipped away at the last moment. The air grew colder the deeper we went. My breath fogged in front of me, even though it had been a mild night when we arrived. The others stayed close, their faces pale in the faint light. It was impossible to tell if the noises we heard were real or just echoes of our own movement. The scuff of shoes on linoleum, the occasional thump that seemed to come from the walls themselves. We reached the old medical wing, the floor sticky with something I didn't want to think about. The smell was stronger there, more sour and metallic. One of us, Adam maybe, pointed to the far end of the room. There was a figure standing there, just barely visible in the torchlight. It didn't move. Before any of us could react, the lights flared again, the same burst of blinding brightness. When it dimmed, the figure was gone, and so was Adam. We didn't stop running after that. The hallway seemed longer than it had when we came in, stretching out ahead of us like some cruel trick. Every corner we turned looked the same, as though the asylum had rearranged itself to keep us trapped. The torches were dying, their beams growing weaker. The air grew colder still, and I could barely feel my fingers. One by one, The others disappeared, taken by bursts of light or dragged into the dark by something I couldn't see. By the time I found the front doors, I was alone. They were right where they had been, but they wouldn't open, no matter how hard I pushed. Behind me, I felt movement, like something brushing past in the dark. My torch flickered once and died, leaving me in total blackness. I don't know how I got out. I don't remember the doors opening, but somehow I found myself outside, gasping for air. The others weren't there. The cameras weren't there. Just me standing on that overgrown patch of land, staring at the asylum as its windows glowed faintly. I haven't been back since. But sometimes, late at night, I think I see those shapes in the corner of my vision, black blotches swimming in the grey, and I don't think I'm alone.